I want to sit with that for a minute. My name is Walter, and I've spent the better part of my life watching people. Not in a clinical way. I'm not a doctor or a scientist. I'm just a man who learned early that if you keep your mouth shut long enough and pay attention, the world tells you things. It doesn't tell people who are always talking. And one of the things the world told me over many years and many faces is this: the people who carry the most are almost never the people who look like they're carrying anything. You learn to read it in small ways. The slight delay before someone answers how they're doing, the way certain people over-prepare for things that should be simple, the ones who apologize for taking up space. I started noticing decades ago that a particular kind of person walks through life like they're waiting for permission to exist. And nearly every time when I got close enough to know their story, I found the same thing underneath. They had been put through something brutal, early and quietly, and they had survived it without applause. If that describes you, I'd like you to stay with me, because I think you've been told the wrong story about what happened to you. The story you were given is that you struggled, that you had a hard time, that life dealt you a difficult hand, and you somehow got through it. That's the polite version, the version that fits on a greeting card. And it's wrong. Not because it's false, but because it's small. It treats your worst seasons as accidents, as bad weather, as something that simply happened to you the way rain happens to a field. I don't believe that anymore, and by the end of this, I don't think you will either. Let me tell you about a man who was buried alive by his own family. Joseph. You probably know the broad strokes. Favorite son, the coat, the brothers who hated him. But sit with the actual sequence of it, because we tend to rush past the part that matters. His brothers threw him in a pit, a dry well. Think about what that is for a second. A hole in the ground, walls too steep to climb, the sky a small circle of light far above you, and the voices of the people who are supposed to love you arguing overhead about whether to kill you or sell you. They settled on selling, as if that were mercy. And here's the detail that has stayed with me my whole life. Scripture tells us that while Joseph sat in that pit, his brothers sat down nearby and ate a meal. They had lunch while he was screaming, or maybe past screaming, and into that silence that comes after, they passed the bread. Now, Joseph did not know in that pit that he would one day stand second only to Pharaoh over all of Egypt. He did not know he would save those exact brothers from starvation. He did not know that the language he would use to describe it all years later would be, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." In the pit, he knew none of that. In the pit, all he knew was that he had been abandoned and that nobody was coming. But something was happening to him in that hole that he could not see. He was being separated, removed, pulled out of the comfortable life of the favored son and dropped into a process that would, over many years, forge him into the only man in the kingdom capable of doing what needed to be done when the famine came. The pit wasn't the end of his story. It was the entrance exam. And notice how long the exam ran. We say Joseph went to Egypt and became a ruler like it happened over a weekend. It didn't. There were years in Potiphar's house, doing well, being trusted, building something, and then a lie from a woman he'd refused, and back down he went. Into prison this time, lower than the pit. He interpreted a dream for a man who promised to remember him, And then that man walked free and forgot him for 2 full years. 2 years. Read that line again sometime. The cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. The test wasn't one drop into darkness. It was a staircase down, landing after landing, each one teaching him that he could not save himself and that the timing was not his to set. By the time he stood before Pharaoh, every shred of arrogance the favored boy once had was gone, burned clean. What stood there instead was a man who could hold power without being poisoned by it. That's what the staircase made. I want you to hear me carefully, because this is the thing I came to say. The hardest thing you ever went through was not random, and it was not punishment. It was a test. And you should pay attention to the fact that you're still here to be told that, because passing is the only reason you can hear me now. I know how that lands for some of you. There's a part of you, maybe, that bristles at the word test, because the word test implies a watcher, a grader, someone keeping score. And if there was someone watching, you want to know where they were. You want to know how anyone could watch what you went through and call it a test instead of stopping it. I understand that. I've sat with that question myself. On nights, I don't talk about much. So let me be honest with you about something, the way I'd be honest with you if we were sitting across a kitchen table and the coffee had gone cold. Years ago, I knew a woman, I'll keep her nameless, she's still living, who lost nearly everything in a span of about 18 months. Her marriage, her health, a child's well-being, her standing among people she'd thought were friends. One thing after another, the way it sometimes comes, like the sky decided to empty all at once. And I remember asking her, much later, when the worst had passed, how she made it through. I expected her to say something about faith, something tidy. She didn't. She looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "Walter, I didn't make it through. The person who started that didn't make it. Somebody else came out the other side, and I'm only now getting to know her." That stopped me cold, because she'd put words to something I'd seen 100 times and never named. The test doesn't just measure you, it remakes you. You don't pass it the way you pass a quiz, by getting back the same self with a better grade. You pass it by becoming someone the old you couldn't have imagined, someone with a spine the old you didn't have, a depth the old you couldn't reach, a quiet the old you would have mistaken for emptiness, but which is actually the opposite. It's fullness. It's the weight of having been somewhere most people never go and come back from. Look at Job. Everyone reaches for Job when they talk about suffering, and usually they get it wrong. They make it a story about patience, about a man who endured and got everything back doubled at the end, like the cosmos balancing its books. But read it slowly, and you'll see the part nobody quotes. At the end, after all of it, the lost children, the lost wealth, the body covered in sores, the friends who turned his agony into a debate. Job says something strange. He says, "I had heard of you with the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." He's not talking about getting his stuff back. He's saying he used to know God the way you know a country from a postcard, and now he knows it the way you know a place you've actually walked. The suffering didn't give him a better life. It gave him sight. And here's what unsettles me every time. He counts that as the real reward, not the doubled flocks, the seeing. And think about who Job was before. The book is careful to tell us he was the greatest man in the East. Blameless, upright, rich beyond measure. He was also, if we're honest, a man who had never been tested, a man whose goodness had never once cost him anything. It's easy to be upright when uprightness is rewarded with everything you have. The accusation laid against him, the whole question the book turns on, was simple. Does he serve God for nothing or only because it pays? Take away the pay and watch. That was the test. And what Job discovered at the bottom of it was that there was something in him that held even when the paying stopped. He didn't know that about himself before. He couldn't have. You cannot find out whether your faith is real until the day it stops being profitable. That day is terrible. It is also the only day that gives you the answer. I think that's what the test is actually for. Not to break you, to open your eyes, and to show you what was in you the whole time, underneath the part of you that was only there because life was easy. There's a thing I've noticed about people who've genuinely been through the fire. And I mean really through it. Not the people who collect hardships like badges and tell you about them at parties. The genuine ones have a stillness. You feel it the moment you're near them. They don't startle easy. They don't need the conversation to go their way. They've already faced the thing they were most afraid of, and they found out it didn't kill them, and that knowledge sits in them like ballast in a ship. The wind can blow. They don't tip. Most people never get that. Most people spend their whole lives arranging things so they'll never have to find out what they're made of. And there's no shame in wanting a soft life. I won't pretend otherwise, but softness has a cost nobody warns you about. The cost is that you never meet yourself. You go your whole life as a stranger to your own strength because it was never called on, never summoned, never asked to show up. You were asked. That's the difference. Something in your life reached in and demanded that you become more than you were, faster than you wanted to, with less help than you deserved. And you answered. You may not have answered gracefully. You may have answered while cursing and crying and certain you couldn't. But you answered because you're here. Let me bring in another one. Hagar. We forget her, but we shouldn't. She was a servant, used and then discarded, sent out into the wilderness with a boy and a skin of water and no plan, because the politics of someone else's household had no more use for her. The water runs out. She puts the child under a bush so she won't have to watch him die, and she walks a little distance away, and she weeps. That's the bottom. That's a human being at the absolute floor of what a person can bear. What I take from that isn't a magic trick about water. It's this. She was being watched in the exact moment she was most certain she'd been forgotten. The watching didn't announce itself. It didn't stop her pain in advance, but it was there, and at the floor of her despair, it became visible. And afterward, she does something no one else in those old stories does. She gives God a name, El Roi, the God who sees me. She names the watcher. I think a lot of you have lived the first half of that story and never got to the second. You've been in the wilderness. You set the child under the bush metaphorically. You put down the thing you couldn't bear to watch die, your hope, your dream, your faith in people. And you walked off a little ways to fall apart in private, the way the dignified do. What you may not have done yet is turn around and realize that the whole time, in the worst of it, you were seen. Not rescued on your schedule, not spared, but seen. Held in an attention you couldn't feel. Here's why that matters, and it's not sentimental, so don't brace for sentiment. When you believe your suffering was unwitnessed, you draw a conclusion from it. The conclusion is, I don't matter. Because in our minds, importance and attention are the same thing. The things that matter get watched. The king has guards on him. The treasure has a vault. So if you went through hell and nobody was watching, the math your heart does is simple and devastating. I must be worth nothing. There must be nothing in me worth protecting. But flip it. If you were watched, if the hardest thing you ever survived was, in fact, observed from beginning to end by something that did not look away, then the math runs the other direction entirely. You don't watch what doesn't matter. You don't test what you intend to throw away. You test the steel you're planning to build something with. You stress the beam you mean to put weight on. The very fact that you were put through it is evidence not of your worthlessness, but of the opposite. You were being prepared to hold weight, real weight, the kind most people are never trusted with. I told you I'd put myself in this, so here it is, and then I'll let you go. There was a season in my own life. I was younger, though not young enough to have an excuse, when I lost my footing entirely. I won't lay out the details, because the details aren't the point, and some of them aren't only mine to tell. But I'll tell you the shape of it. For about 2 years, I lived in a kind of fog where nothing I touched worked and no one I reached for reached back, and I became convinced with the total certainty of a drowning man that I had been singled out for ruin, that whatever runs the universe had looked at me specifically and decided I was the one who didn't get to have things work out. I was wrong, but not in the way you'd think. I wasn't wrong that I'd been singled out. I'd just misread what I was singled out for. Because here's what I can see now, with 20-some years of distance, that I could not possibly have seen then. Everything I am able to do for people now, every conversation like this one, every time someone sits across from me unraveling and I'm able to stay steady and not flinch, every bit of that came out of those 2 years. I don't have a single useful thing to offer anyone that didn't get hammered into me during the season I was sure I was being destroyed. The fog wasn't ruin, it was tuition. I was paying in advance for a capacity I'd need later and couldn't have bought any other way. And I'll tell you the exact moment it turned, because it wasn't dramatic. There was no light from the sky. I was sitting on the back step one ordinary evening, too tired to even be sad properly anymore, and a thought came to me, as plain as if someone had said it out loud. The thought was, what if none of this is wasted? Not, what if it ends soon? Not, what if you get it all back? Just, what if none of it is wasted? And something in me eased just slightly, for the first time in a long while, because I realized I could survive almost anything if I knew it wasn't for nothing. It was never the pain that was crushing me. It was the suspicion that the pain was pointless. The moment I let go of that suspicion, not because anything had proven it wrong, but because I chose to bet against it, the whole weight of the thing changed character. It stopped being a punishment I was enduring and became a price I was paying. And a price you can pay. A punishment you can only suffer. If you'd told me all that at the time, I'd have wanted to hit you. I want to be honest about that too. There's a kind of comfort that's an insult when you're in the middle of the pain, and this is all preparing you for something is high on the list. So I'm not going to insult you. I'm not going to tell you to feel grateful for what happened, or to call it a gift, or to slap a bow on it. Some of what you went through was just wrong, and it's allowed to stay wrong. But wrong and meaningful are not opposites. That's the thing I'd give almost anything to have understood sooner. A thing can be genuinely unjust, genuinely cruel, never something you'd wish on anyone, and still be the exact ground in which the most important parts of you grew. Joseph never says the pit was good. He says God meant it for good. There's a universe of difference between those two sentences, and you can live in that difference. The brothers were wrong. The selling was wrong, and it built the only man who could feed a nation through 7 years of famine. Both true. Hold them both. So let me say the thing I came to say plainly before I go. You passed the hardest test of your life, the one nobody graded out loud, the one you took alone in a room with the lights off. You passed it. You know how I know? Because you're still here, listening to a stranger talk about it instead of having been swallowed by it. The proof of passing is not that you feel triumphant. The proof is that you're upright, that you got up this morning, that something in you is still reaching toward meaning, still wanting to understand, still capable of being moved by the idea that maybe it counted for something. The defeated don't reach. You're reaching. That's the grade. And you were watched the whole time. Not from a comfortable distance, not by something that enjoyed it, but the way a father watches a child take the fall he knows the child has to take, fists clenched, ready, letting it happen, because letting it happen is the only way the child learns to stand. You weren't abandoned in the fire, you were attended in it. The silence you took for absence was something closer to held breath. I don't know what your test was. I don't need to. The shapes differ. For one, it's grief. For another, it's betrayal. For another, it's a long, slow erosion of everything they planned. For another, it's a body that turned on them or a mind that did. The shapes are infinite, but the structure is always the same. You were taken somewhere you didn't want to go. You were stripped of what you thought you couldn't live without. You found out you could live without it. And you came back carrying something you didn't have before, even if you can't name it yet. Name it. That's Hagar's whole lesson. She didn't get her old life back. She got a name for the one who'd seen her, and she walked out of the wilderness a different person than the servant who'd walked in. You don't have to make peace with the cruelty, but you do, at some point, get to turn around and name what was true even in the cruelty, that you were seen, that you held, that you came through, that the person reading this is not the person who went in. Here's what I'll ask of you, and it's a real ask, not a closing line. I want you to think of the test, the one that came to mind the second I started talking. You know the one. You've already named it in your head. And in the comments, I want you to write one sentence, just one. The sentence is this: what you can do now that you couldn't do before it, not how bad it was. We all know how bad it was. I want the other thing, the capacity, the sight, the steadiness, the compassion, the strength you'd never have found in a softer life. The thing the pit gave you that the comfortable life never could have. Write that one sentence, because someone is going to scroll through and read yours. Someone who's still down in their pit right now, certain no one is watching and certain they won't survive. And your one sentence is going to be the small circle of light they look up and see. Be that for somebody. You, of all people, know what it would have meant. I've watched a long time. I'll keep watching. And I'm telling you what I've seen. You passed.